So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We're so glad that you can join us for a wonderful session today. And before I introduce our program, we got word this morning that a very important person in the world of Jewish music, cantor Naftali Hershtig, has undergone a very serious surgery. And I'd like to give Alex Klein just a few minutes.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'd like to mention that our patron, Naftali Hershtig, has had a kidney transplant this morning, and on behalf of everyone here, we wish him well and refuah shalema. And if we want to daven for him or say some prayers, his Hebrew name is Naftali Hertz Ben Chaya. So we all wish him well and hope that he has a speedy recovery. He has done so much for the art of the cantor and Jewish liturgy with his Tel Aviv Cantorial Institute. And as one of our patrons, we hold him in very, very high esteem. So on behalf of everybody, we wish him well and a complete refuah shalema. Thank you.
Refuah shlema, and thank you very much, Alex. So before we begin this program today, I wanted to share some wonderful news on our end at UCLA. We announced the launch just last week of the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience. I'm pleased to be the director of this program, and together with our very talented staff, Dr. Lori Black and Beth Kramer, we look forward to many different programs, and we invite you to check out our website for some of our upcoming programs. We are very engaged at the center with running our weekly COZ events. Dr. Lori Black is a very important technical person who's helps to make sure that everything is working well. And I just want to give a shout out to two of our students, to Joanna Rosenthal and Eva Kaganitsky, for all of their wonderful work that they do behind the scenes, who are admitting people in, making sure things are recorded, making sure that everything is working. So we're very grateful to them. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's program featuring David Amram, to be interviewed by Dr. Jeff Janeczko. I get the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jeff Janeczko, who has worked with me on other programs with COZ and a real true partner. Dr. Jeff Janeczko received his doctorate from UCLA in our ethnomusicology program and is an expert on the Jewish avant-garde New York jazz composers. And Jeff is the Chief Operating Officer of the Milken Archive and a very close partner of many of our activities together. So I'll turn it over to Jeff, who will introduce our wonderful and esteemed guest for today.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I will apologize in advance in the event that you hear a little bit of disturbances in the background here. There is just a little bit of masonry going on the other side of this door over here. I hope it won't be too disruptive. It was supposed to be happening a little bit later than it is currently happening. So today I have the honor, and it's a distinct honor and immense challenge, I should say, to introduce David Amram, and I mean both honor and challenge very seriously. I've come to know David over the past 10 years or so through my work with the Milken Archive. And in all of this time, I have to say there are not many musicians I've known in my life for whom the words humble and gracious are the words that come to mind most frequently when I think of them. You know, many musicians feel that in order to be successful, we have to be, project an air of confidence. And I think David just defies this in so many ways. I've spent many hours with him on the phone over the years. We have never actually met in person. But what I have found is it's always really difficult to get him to talk about himself, because he spends all of his time talking about all of the people to whom he credits so much of his success. So this humility, this graciousness is one of the reasons that I feel honored to be able to host him today. And the challenge lies in the fact that this humility is directly at odds with so many of his accomplishments. David is a man who collaborated with Jack Kerouac, with Allen Ginsberg, who really helped define the beat generation that had such an influence on American culture in the latter part of the 20th century. David has provided scores for some 30 productions of Shakespeare in the Park in New York, working with Joseph Papp. He has scored films like Splendor in the Grass and The Manchurian Candidate. He was selected by Leonard Bernstein to be the first ever composer in residence at the New York Philharmonic. He has played jazz with Charles Mingus, Dizzy Gillespie, Lionel Hampton, and Oscar Pettiford, but he has also shared the stage with people like Pete Seeger, with Bob Dylan, and Willie Nelson. He has many, many honors and awards. He has been inducted into the Oklahoma Jazz Hall of Fame. He has received Clearwater's Pete and Toshi Seeger Annual Power of Song Award. He has numerous honorary doctorates and has also received a Lifetime Achievement Award from Moment Magazine. David has also just had his 90th birthday, which is being celebrated with concerts and premieres of his works in New York, in Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and in other cities throughout the US and around the world. And we are very, very fortunate to be in his presence today. So David, welcome. Happy belated 90th birthday, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here. And I'd just like to say shalom to everyone and thank you. Thank Lowell Milken Foundation for supporting and sharing our music with the new generation so that people can see that over the 5,000 years, we haven't just been playing the same tune or tunes, but done an extraordinary amount of music in our travels all around the world since the diaspora. And it seems that every place that we have been, we have left some of what we have. And when we're asked to move on, which in my own family goes back to 1492, when the Queen of Spain said, you either convert or leave town. A lot of that beautiful, what we call Sephardic music today, was music that we left, which was then redone and brought back to us, and music that we've taken to every place that we've been. And that's a continual process. And now, after all these years, we actually have a global awareness among ourselves of what we've contributed. And the Milken Foundation was enormously helpful in putting out that series. I was honored that part of my opera, which we'll hear today in my sacred service, Shir Larev Shabbat, and other music, my symphony, Shirei Neshama, Songs of the Soul, all reflect not just the experiences I've had, but those that people of the Jewish faith and those who loved the musics that we left have shared and taught me, with the idea I could not only use them as a composer, but try to diplomatically share them with everyone in the world, including our own young people who were brought up to feel the most important thing you can do in contemporary society to be a winner is to tone down your ethnicity. In other words, be so colonized that we don't even know who we are and don't want to. And this is a problem that I think that every group in the world faces, and we're beginning to address that among ourselves. That says we've always led the way in thinking and in teaching and in learning. We can kind of share that attitude with others. And that's something that playing music around the world has taught me, that wherever you are, if people can see that you love what you were born into, then they realize that you're interested in what they're doing, not to steal it or to get an identity of your own, but to add to what's already your identity and share that with others. It's kind of
Speaking
a
of
long.
speaking of places we've all been, your life began on a farm in rural Pennsylvania. Could you tell us a little bit about where you were born, what your upbringing was like, and how you got into this love of music?
I was born in Philadelphia at the Lying-In Hospital, and my father and his father and my uncle, whom I was named after, and my father's sister all dreamed, this was way back before I was born in the 20s, of someday living in a kibbutz, because they had those in what was called Palestine at that time. My step-grandmother, in fact, lived there. That's where my grandfather met her after his first wife, Beulah Badlowski, passed away. And since they couldn't leave the U.S. and go to a strange place at that time altogether, they decided to have their own kibbutz. That's what my father told me. And they got a farm in the 1920s in Feasterville, population about 160, depending on whether or not you counted the cattle. And the Jewish population was whoever was in our house at the time. We were the only people. But since there was no temple to go to except way off in Philadelphia, my father conducted services at home, read the Bible, and my grandfather, I remember, tried to teach me Hebrew, but I was so frightened of him that I got a mental block. And it wasn't until my children started to go to Hebrew school that I reclaimed, and I'm still learning and relearning what I was taught as a child. But it stayed with me. And on a certain level, I was able to discover Judaism in a special way, not just because of being beaten up by all the kids in school, because they never knew a Jewish person and knew very little about it. But I realized what my father said was, you have to understand what your heritage is and where you came from, and then deal with that. And the only way to do that is to study and learn and be aware, and not to be that way with other people, to learn to defend yourself. More or less what Eli Wiesel said so long ago, which was, we can and must forgive, but we should never forget. So I was off to a good start, and I've been on that trail ever since. And as I hit 90, this is a big thrill in my life, just to be with all of you and to see something like the foundation, which means that the music will be studied from many different points of view. And when they say serious music or what is Jewish music, there was no such term in the 1930s when I was a little boy growing up, even in the Jewish communities that I was aware of in Philadelphia and places where they had large numbers of Jewish people. But I did learn that you had to be inquisitive, to have respect. And then when people later on would discuss what Jewish music was, that always entailed a gigantic argument, which gave me a picture that if there were 7 people in the room, you'd have 13 different opinions. And that's kind of a wonderful thing too, especially when you learn to understand that being inquisitive, argumentative, sometimes loud and interested is a good thing. And you don't have to fall asleep at the switch and be a zombie to be appreciated.
So we're going to be listening to a few of your pieces today. Speaking of noise, I apologize again for that happening back there. The first piece we're going to listen to and discuss is called Shir Le'erev Shabbat. This is a Friday evening service you composed for the Park Avenue Synagogue in the early 1960s. Maybe you could tell us, was this your first kind of foray into composing any kind of sacred music or music with some kind of a Jewish connection?
This was the first piece that I was formally asked to compose using a Hebrew text. And my father was Sephardic, my mother was Ashkenazic. So he said, I love this, but I can't quite understand Shabbat, we say. So I learned from my father that before the Cantor Putterman explained to me that the Ashkenazic pronunciation was correct for all the people who were brought up that way. And since it was the Park Avenue Synagogue, because there were 2 or 3 ways of doing it, they were all correct. And I should honor the people who asked me to do it by doing the version, the way of Hebrew being sung or spoken or prayed that they wished to use. So Cantor Putterman was extraordinary. And he said, look, David, we've commissioned all these amazing composers, but the only problem is sometimes you can't understand one word of what they're saying. And the poor singers who are reading it off a piece of paper cannot distinguish which accent goes where. So I'm going to go over with you as a kindergarten student every single word. And he was gracious enough to share his enormous knowledge and help me phonetically to be able to write down Matovu, and over and over and over again until I got it correct. And he explained me each section of the service. The one we're going to hear is the welcoming into the temple. So he said, you can save your hot licks and your counterpoint and creativity and excitement. Try to write something that's welcoming. This has been done for several thousand years, so it's probably a good way to start the Friday night service. And he showed me every single syllable of the entire service, so that he said Handel was one of the greatest composers of all the time, but he didn't speak English. He was in a rush to get the Messiah finished. So the famous part, for the Lord God omnipotent, was he didn't know the word omnipotent, or he certainly would have he would have said it omnipotent or something. He said omnipotent because that's what he thought it was supposed to be. And I said, well, Handel was brilliant to only make one mistake. I would have made nothing but mistakes. So I just took his advice. And I'm happy to say that people singing it who have sung it at colleges and schools and places where the chorus that was singing, and even occasionally the cantor, didn't know anything about Jewish music or Jewish culture. And people who did could understand every word.
Now, Cantor Putterman, for those of you who may not be familiar with David Putterman in the Park Avenue Synagogue, he started a program in the mid 1940s to commission very notable composers to write basically classical settings for the synagogue, and he commissioned many very well-known composers, people like Cosimo Tedesco, Kurt Weill, David Diamond. What was it like for you to kind of follow in the footsteps of those of composers like that? Were you aware of what preceded you and what kind of tradition you were stepping in?
Oh yes, because I loved their music. I was the only composer. This is before Leonard Bernstein chose me as the first composer in residence, 1966, 67. So in the 50s and early 60s, I was writing music for Shakespeare in the Park, where Cantor Putterman used to come with his son Zeb to hear the programs and liked my music. And I was writing what Alan Rich, the late music critic, called Hebraic Elizabethan American, because I was brought up listening to Cantor Yosel Rosenblatt at home, and jazz, and Schubert and Haydn and Mozart and Chopin and Bach and Beethoven. And I loved them all. And when I heard Shalomo, I completely flipped out. That was just so beautiful, because there was a great European composer celebrating our roots of what I could hear in Jewish music, but he did it with a symphony in a way. And then, of course, hearing Mahler's First Symphony, not even realizing that he was Jewish and feeling that, I said, wow, there's really something there of every note being beautiful, and what they call in the vernacular the krecht, the tear in the voice. What a beautiful thing that is to hear. And you hear that in all various kinds of music, the human speaking to you, soulful memory sound. And I was so happy just to be able to work with Cantor Putterman. I was thrilled to be in the company of those composers. I didn't feel inadequate. I didn't feel terrified, and I certainly didn't feel jealous. I just felt complimented, and I still do.
Wonderful. So we're going to go ahead and take a listen to your the Matovu from Shir Larev Shevat. It lasts about 3 minutes in length. If I could just ask briefly, I am getting a little bit of background noise from some of the other participants. This is in addition to, of course, the very noisy background noise that you occasionally hear from me. If you could just take a moment to check and make sure that your microphone is muted. I would appreciate that. So here is
Can I mention
David Amram's
this?
Matovu. Yes, go ahead, please.
I believe this was recorded in London, if I'm not mistaken.
That is
Or was
correct.
this
This was recorded with the BBC Singers. Mhm.
Yeah, and the conductor was incredible, and he was Jewish, but he also was a magnificent conductor of all musics, and he was able to get the chorus just to sing so beautifully. And the cantor, I think was just a young man, was amazingly good. And I was very, very fortunate. So it didn't sound like a railroad train conductor calling out the station stops or people grinding through something. It was very soulful. And I'm
All
grateful
right,
for
let's
that.
take a listen. David, if you got my request to unmute there.
Yes.
So really, really gorgeous writing there. I realize in all of the years, the number of times we've talked together, I never asked you much about your formal training. How did you learn to write for voice, and had you ever worked with writing for organ before this?
No, I had written a little bit for the organ, but of course, I dreamed someday of orchestrating the whole piece, and I have orchestrated one or two of the movements. So I thought with the organ, I would try to write an orchestral part and then hope that I could get an organist to get the different sonorities and sounds. And Bruce Prince Joseph, who was the organist with the New York Philharmonic, before I was the composer in residence, fortunately liked my music. And he said, I'll help you. And he was an enormous help. And Maurice Perez, who was the conductor, also helped so we could try to register it. And he said, look, let me give you some advice. Any good musician will know what to do. So I'm going to put in a few indications, and the rest of it, the organist, individual organist will know which registrations to use. And if they don't have an organ that can do that, they can just play it as it is, and you have everything there. And I've done that at just about everything that I've written. My piano reductions, of course, because the organists can use their feet as well. So they have 4 hands rather than counting their feet almost, rather than just the 10 fingers. They also have those 2 feet. And everything that I've written, because of the background I had in playing with Charles Mingus and Oscar Pettiford and Dizzy Gillespie and playing with folk players where you had to get the right note at the right time. There wasn't a choice. And you couldn't set the piano on fire and say that that was protesting American foreign policy and get a grant by doing something to empty the house out. That was a different kind of a venue. And you couldn't do that in Temple. And you couldn't do that when you were playing in the Bach B minor Mass or any place. Every place I was always a concern about saying something, being for real, and telling your story. And this is what I tried to do in all of my symphonic compositions. And those that were based on Native American or American Indian music, or some of the music from the Middle East where they have no chords per se. And the counterpoint, the different weaving of the voices is replaced by polyphony, by different rhythms. I learned that there's a certain honesty and a certain feeling, and you could do almost anything, but you have to somehow keep it for real. So when I used the organ, at first I was shocked because the times I've been, my father's temple that he used to go to in Philadelphia, they had no organ, of course, in an Orthodox synagogue. But Cantor Putterman explained to me that they were adapting the organ because that was something that they had a beautiful organ at the temple. And the organists that they had were just amazingly, amazingly good. So I had help from organists and I had help from Cantor Putterman. And at least I was smart enough to listen. And if I could get help and instruction, it was a beautiful, beautiful thing, which I appreciated and still appreciate.
Sure. So you spoke a little bit about the kind of ethos that you took from some of the folk music that you played, about hitting the right note at the right time, about the, the feeling coming from a very genuine place. And it provides kind of a nice segue to the next piece we'll talk about, because it is called Songs of the Soul. This is one of your symphonic works, and you have written quite a bit of symphonic music. The tie into folk music, I suppose, is relevant here because when you wrote this, you said you wanted to celebrate the polycultural nature of the Jewish people. And to do that, you went out and found a bunch of different Jewish folk traditions from different parts of the world to serve as kind of thematic material for the symphony, correct?
Well, yes, the first movement was based on an Ethiopian Passover chant. And when I heard that, just as any kind of music, I didn't get a book and then look for the people who were represented in the book, but rather the other way around. I would hear someone in a dry cleaning store or a delicatessen or a temple or a concert hall, whatever it was. And if it was something that touched my heart, I wanted to get next to it and meet the people who did that and see if I could find out something about it just because I was interested. And that music just touched me so much when I heard that chant. And I thought, my gosh, how could I possibly write the percussion part? Because it was amazing, sort of like a three, like a 3 and a 4, like a 7, but with an extra 16th note and some breaths in between. But it had a certain phrasing and feeling. You could notate it, but it was incredible. So I thought, well, I'll just do the best I can and make it playable. So when the symphony players are playing it, they won't have to say, I wonder what he meant by that. They can sit down, pick up their instrument, pick up the piece of paper, play it a few times, and hopefully feel the same thing that I felt when I decided to compose it. And that was based on what I heard that made me feel that in the first place. The second movement was just from my imagination, based on the beautiful traditional music of Central European Jewish music, which we have so much of, fortunately, and which so many of the cantors in the United States do so beautifully. So I was able to hear Cantor Yosel Rosenblatt as a child and just felt it more than tried to take just what he did, the feeling. And I tried to write a song without words, as Mendelssohn did, not realizing that Mendelssohn was Jewish and had to switch over to survive. But the feeling, he didn't switch over. And I had that feeling before I even knew that there was such a thing. So I went, and everything that I've written, including all the Jewish music, coming from some kind of a feeling, which is more than I'll ever understand, but that's the gift that we all share, the mitzvah of our heritage, which of course sociologists and analytic people would say is it's free, it's a gift, therefore it's not worth anything, so it's worthless. And I realized from my father and everyone else I met that I respected and loved that it wasn't worthless, it was priceless. So the second movement was just based on what I felt from what had come before me. And it was somehow inside of me, and I didn't even know what it was, and I still don't, but I follow that. The third movement was based on a wonderful Sephardic setting of Lecha Dodi that was taught to me by Avram Pengas, who came from the Sephardic Jewish community in Greece, was in Israel, and decided to come to the United States, fortunately for us here, and had an enormous encyclopedic knowledge of all musics and taught me this wonderful melody. Etc. And I used that entire traditional melody, and I set the famous tov. That's what people, Jewish people, as we all know, call the drum, Esther's drum, the dumbek. It's called the dumbek, the tombek in Egypt. The Jewish community calls it the tabla, not like the Indian tabla, but they're different names. But it's that famous rhythm, and that. And of course, the wonderful tambourine parts where the band leader leads the band, not with the baton, but with the tambourine on their shoulder. And I tried to use some of those kinds of music that I knew from playing with Middle Eastern and with Jewish musicians and musicians who from Israel who had come here and knew all the different forms of musics that had come to Israel from around the world and sort of come back home, so to speak. And I tried to incorporate those into what I was writing for the percussion so that they could play correctly what the music was based on. And then having the pizzicato and the shell would boom, back, back, boom, back, boom, back, back, boom, back, boom, back, back, boom, back, boom, back, back, boom, back. And you can write all of those things down if you can sing them and you can dance to them and you can play them and you can be with people. And then it's amazing how musicians who aren't familiar with any of that, if it's notated correctly, can feel something, put their own feelings into that, and then you have what's known as music, because then the people listening can hear and feel something themselves, rather than having it be a wonder-bred lecture, so to speak.
So speaking of speaking, David, I'm getting a little bit of feedback that people can hear me much better than they can hear you. And I would much rather have people hear you than me. Maybe you could move your microphone a little bit closer.
Certainly.
Because we had really good sound going at the beginning.
Lean into the
it's
microphone.
Okay. Yeah, we can't even, it's not covering up your face or anything. So,
that's okay. Is this better?
Is everyone hearing that a little bit better now?
Hello, everybody.
Well, we'll assume that they can only talk for another a minute or so before we listen to a movement from Shirei Neshama. We're going to listen to the third movement of this, which it uses the Yemenite Lechadodi melody that you just played, and you showed us some of those wonderful rhythms. Could you talk a little about, well, let me maybe preface this by saying the piece follows a basic rondo form, so there are different sections, and each section kind of has a different theme. I know there's at least one other theme in there that's drawn from a Sephardic folk tune, and then there are a couple of other themes that I'm assuming are of your own creation in there.
Yes, but it was a rondo form because I love traditional European music, and there's a reason why composers wrote those forms. I think without a structure, you don't have anything. And I found every sincere music built to last has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and purity of intent, and an exquisite choice of notes. So Stravinsky said that with the ballet, the structure of having to fit into a certain timetable made it easier to be creative because he had a structure to create and limitations, and within those limitations, infinite freedom to work. And I think that there has to be a structure, even if the listeners don't know anything about it, they can feel that it's organized and not just the let's get a grant and whatever. That's fine for certain things, but that really is not anything that I've interested me in music or in life for more than 30 seconds. So this is used as a strict rondo form, and the rondo, after the development, the tune, the second theme in the rondo was based on the wonderful old Sephardic song about a woman being called, and George Mogradishian, who was the Middle Eastern roots of Jewish music trio that I worked with 30 some years, taught me this beautiful old melody that Elizabeth Gans, a wonderful scholar who played Sephardic music so beautifully all over the world, Elizabeth taught him this tune and George taught it to me. But again, I took the liberty of making it about 3 times slower than it's usually played because it was such a gorgeous melody. And I thought it would be really nice to do that and then reharmonize it and change it and develop it from that. But that's all auto mechanics. The beautiful part is when it's played, people so far that I've heard don't snore, turn on the radio or read a book. They actually listen to it. And that's all we can dream of as a composer or a person, to say something and have the other person at the other end of the line receptive.
All right, let's see how receptive all of us are. I'm going to play the third movement from David's Symphony Songs of the Soul, Shirei Neshama. It is subtitled Dance of Joy. The movement lasts about 14 minutes, but it's really worth listening to it in its entirety. So I'm going to go ahead and play the whole thing. I have a very, very rudimentary kind of structural sketch of the movement up here that just show where some of the different themes come in and out. And I hope that will help you sort of follow along a little bit. And then during the Q&A, I'm sure we can have some nice discussion about how David weaves all of these different themes together. David, that ending gets me every single time I listen to it. There's just such a climax there. But I was struck in listening to it this time also. Each little section of the rondo kind of has its own distinct feel, its own character. I believe even its own tempo. How did you put all of that together?
Well, I just tried to do it, uh, spending a great deal of time ripping up paper and using the great 20th century innovation, the eraser and the wastebasket. And finally, when I was all done, I looked it over as a conductor, which I also do, and started with a whole different viewpoint of, wait a minute, and then tried to go over the whole piece in my mind to get the tempos, the changes, and make sure that it fit together so that it was like a great 7-course dinner with everything fitting perfectly from course to course and being nourishing and nutritious for the soul at the end. And one of the wonderful things is that was conducted by Chris Wilkins, who is not Jewish, and the German orchestra in Berlin, radio orchestra. And since many of my relatives came from there, all of whom were incinerated except for 3 that escaped, there was not what you call a big Jewish population when those people were growing up. And by picking up the paper and being such terrific musicians, and Chris being such a wonderful conductor, when I was listening to it, I could feel it was definitely taking myself, and I hope other people, to a different place than they'd been before. And that's the wonderful thing about classical music from the European tradition, that you can actually create a world. And conversely, when you play American music, Native American or jazz or Cajun or folk music in other countries where they've never seen an American, the music takes you to that place. And my hope is that this particular piece and other pieces that I've written based on my Jewish heritage will take people to those places. And when I finally went to Israel with David Brosa, I was invited back and I conducted the Ra'anana Symphoniette for the 3rd time. And we did this piece in Tel Aviv for an audience of people that grow up hearing that famous Yemenite melody probably twice a day. And they also had the wonderful Kenneth Kiesler, who conducted the opera we're going to hear. And he was able to help in the recordings that he made that we're going to hear of a group of people. When we were in the studio at Ann Arbor, Michigan, I thought, boy, I'm right here in the Holy Land. And I went out during intermission, and instead of seeing a bunch of older, great, devoted Jewish musicians, it looked like the future farmers of America. All these young students from all over the country, I think most of whom probably weren't Jewish, playing the music and making you feel that you were there. And that's the wonderful thing that music can do. And that's the wonderful thing that notated music can do. So while I'm known as an improviser and a freestylist and all that stuff lyrically, I also am from the old school of trying to write it down specifically and clearly enough to give the people who are playing it a chance to be creative themselves. I know that's a lot of philosophy to absorb, but for those of you who are students and listening, if you're studying species, counterpoint, and harmony, and Palestrina and composers like Guillaume de Machaut, who came way before Bach, you're doing a good thing to help you out in everything that you do. And then if you can improvise, you'll keep attuned to your feelings and to being creative on the spot and to being willing to do it 13 times till you get it right.
You mentioned music being able to take people places, and for the final piece, which you've alluded to already, we're going not quite literally, but maybe a little more literally to a different place. This is a very dark place, and you mentioned your connection to relatives that that you lost in the Holocaust. And the final piece that we are going to look at is a short excerpt from an opera that you wrote. This is set in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and involves a group of prisoners who want to hold a Passover Seder within the confines of this horrible environment, and have to go to very great lengths to gather the necessary ingredients for the Seder plate. Maybe you could just set us up a little bit for the excerpt that we'll hear here.
Well, this was based on a play by Reginald Rose, which was based on a true story of a group of prisoners who were incarcerated and wanted to celebrate Pesach somehow. And they did. And apparently this was done. And to the extent that they were able to do that, they had to bypass and ingratiate themselves enough with the guards to be able to sort of get away with it. I asked Igor Sadarsky, who had the Art Foods Delicatessen and Yeshiva for the sometimes non-observant Jewish people like myself at that time, because in a concentration camp and his wife had been, and they both survived and found one another. And Igor told me he was sitting up on a hill in the sunshine having some humantasha with his wife, and he said to her, you know, if we've been through all of this, we'd better find out what our religion and our culture is about. So he began, as a survivor, to start really studying. And when you went into his place, where I was allowed to make my own gigantic sandwiches, I also learned more, not just about cooking, but more about Judaism than I ever dreamed I would have, because he graciously took everybody who was interested and gave us crash courses in Yiddishkeit, in the different languages and the different traditions, the different ways that Jewish people were all over the world. When I was the director of the International Jewish Arts Festival of Music for 17 years, found people from all over the world, I understood what Igor was talking about. But in 1964, when I was writing this opera, I wanted to be sure at least that when the Germans spoke, we were saying correctly. And he told me exactly what the guards had yelled at him. So we got that part really authentically correct. And he also made some small suggestions in the script when it was too self-indulgent, said, no, that wouldn't have happened. So we had a first-hand person help us with that. As far as the music, I just followed the story, and it just came naturally because I could feel it. And it was wonderful. Arnold Weinstein made a beautiful libretto out of the opera, and it was shown on ABC television for 4 seasons every Passover. They wanted it to be like Menotti's wonderful Christmas piece that he had written. And then ABC television in the 1970s, they had color TV, so they took 30,000 black and white tapes and put them in the nearest dumpster. Fortunately, the person who had the original tape kept it in his office and gave me a copy. Miraculously, I have a copy now, which I'd like to donate to the foundation for them to have on file, and is public domain so people can see it and hear and I've shown it at many, many temples and places I've gone to at Jewish community centers and talked about the opera. And my hope is it will encourage other people. And one of the wonderful things is not only that they included some portions of this in the Milken Foundation, but also they did the opera The Golem, which was an amazing piece based on Jewish music. And the sort of snobbish New York Times critics put it down as just a piece of junk, I think, without even listening to it. This was a long time ago, because at that time there was no appreciation of what they called ethnic music. Even the critics who were Jewish referred to anything overtly Jewish as ethnic, which Floyd Red Crow Westerman, a Native American, told me was a code word, a colonial code word for subhuman. And some of the beautiful music that was referred to in that way, as if it was worthless, is now being appreciated and is such a rich heritage. I wanted to say that for all of the people who are students, who are listening and studying and possibly being told by people in higher places, don't spend your time. As I was told when I wanted to have Shir Lorev Shabbat and some other pieces played when I was with the Ranana Symphony and went to Israel Philharmonic, the manager, this was a long time ago, 20 years ago, said, "We don't do anything overtly Jewish unless we have to." That's changed, thank heavens, in all cultures all over the world. So I think our job diplomatically and graciously is to certainly start with ourselves and our community and tell people to be proud of their heritage, because it's a gift that we're given at birth, whether we know about it or not. And very often you see now people, young people, second and third generation, coming back to what their grandparents brought with them from the old country, wherever that was, to the new country, wherever they are, and finding the beauty in heritage. And every person, you realize, and you can find it in the Talmud, not from me, every person has some kind of heritage, and they're all precious and they're all sacred. And certainly ours wouldn't be here over 5,000 years if it weren't of eternal value. So all of us are just plugging along. So it's not a question of being humble, it's just being aware that there's something bigger than us. And that's a wonderful thing. So then you're not humble, because we've all got plenty to be humble about.
Indeed. I want to open it up for discussion soon, but before we do that, I do want people to have a chance to hear this opera. Maybe you could just set up the scene we're going to listen to a little bit. We're going to lead into a rather large group of people singing the Yigdal prayer, correct?
Yes, well, that was my own idea. Of course, that wouldn't have happened in a concentration camp, and it didn't happen in general, except when Yigdal was sung, and they certainly wouldn't have used the harmonies and the rhythms that I did. But that was after a long, really heartbreaking and depressing experience. This ended up on a note of triumph, which you can see in the opera when the person who's leading the service says, "Now we will sing the Yigdal, the song of rejoicing," which it was. So I used that. And after he sang the Shema Israel, I put the Yigdal, and that was what they call artistic license, I guess, or a way to have a good, joyous, and triumphant ending. And all the people I met who were survivors that heard it loved that part, because they said that's what it should be, that we somehow triumphed because we survived and are surviving. And we shouldn't forget that. And we should remember joy. That's why the piece we heard before was also, I put in parenthesis, Frelach, because the ba-da-ba, boom, 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 was also used in the great dance Joy. I put down Dance of Joy, parenthesis, Frelach. So the end of the opera ends triumphantly. And it was wonderful that the conductor, again, Ken Kiesler, an amazing conductor, managed to get a group of kids who probably didn't even know any Jewish people or anything about Jewish music to get the essence of that feeling, and also take the music off the paper and make it real.
Let's hear how they did.
hymn of rejoicing.
Well, David, if nothing else, you know triumphant endings. I'll give you that.
Thank you.
I could just point out to all of our guests here that if you want to learn more about David's work in the Milken Archive, he has a profile page on the Milken Archive website. You can find him very easily there. We're very happy to have him represented there. If you want to learn more about his work outside of the Milken Archive, it's davidamram.com, I believe. His homepage has lots of fascinating information about his history and his very broad and diverse body of music. I have been honored to be able to be your would-be host for the day, and I'd like to turn it over for questions and discussion at this point. Unless David, you'd like to offer any closing words before
Just to
we.
thank all of you who worked so hard to put on this program and all the other educational programs that they do, and to Lowell Milken and to Herb Albert, who helped to start the school at UCLA. Instead of building skyscrapers or statues for themselves, they decided to use some of their hard-earned money and enrich the Jewish heritage and everyone's in the world's appreciation of our culture and our music. And just as one of the many, many people who benefited from that, not just as a composer, but as a listener and as a lifetime yeshiva bocher myself in the University of Haggautology, which is the greatest school of all, learning from those who know more than you do. I just want to thank both of them and thank all of you here this afternoon, Geraldine and Mr. Cohen, Alex Klein, Mark Kligman, and Jeff, Jeff Janeczko, of course, yourself, for all of your work. And for all the students, keep on studying. And if you're told by your career counselors that you're wasting your time, that there's no interest in music, art, poetry, religion, heritage, that's a constitutional right anyone has to misinform you. And possibly they're discouraged with their own work. And that's also, you're entitled to feel that way. But spend time with other people who might be able to show you, as I've been shown and still am shown all my life, that there's a higher purpose in life than staring in the mirror. And our old prayer, which has become called the golden rule in every other religion, of caring for others and treating them the way you would like to be treated, still is about as relevant and meaningful and rewarding as it gets. I know you didn't need to hear a sermon, but at 90, I just wanted to share that with you because that's what I found out. The Solomon-esque wisdom of old age is, you ain't as great as you hoped you might have become. And who cares in the first place? The important thing is to make some kind of contribution while we're here. And that tzedekah in our tradition, what they would call a tip or charity, is not because you're slumming and you're feeling sorry for someone else and overcoming guilt by putting a nickel in someone's pocket, but rather a natural, organic way to be a real mensch. And that's what David Brosa told me before the word mensch was used in Israel. He said the best way to say that is Hadavar Hashi Hashu B'Chaim Zelechiyot Ben Adam. Most important thing in the world is to be a real mensch, and all of us are born that way. We have to remember to be that way. So I would love to hear some questions or answers from any of you who have been watching and listening to this, and thank you for having me as your guest.
David, it's Michael Shapiro. I have to say that last time I was going to visit you, I mean, I can call you on the phone and talk to you. So we have a lot of people here on that should ask questions of you. And there have been questions that have already been put on the chat. But you are an American treasure. You're a Jewish treasure, and we love you. And I'm so glad you were able to do this today on COZ. I first encountered your music through Ellie Siegmeister, actually before, when I saw The Final Ingredient on ABC TV when I was a young kid, and I was very taken by it. So my first question to you is, which you haven't really mentioned, you've danced around it a little. You've spoken about Jewish causes and Jewish heritage, but you, for your entire life, with great pain and suffering and also joy, have been a champion for human rights. So I want you to talk about human rights and Jewish life and how they mix in the soul of David Amram, which I love. So talk about it.
Well, very briefly, I think that we were all put here for a reason, and that every single person, something of a gift to share with the world while we are here. And secondly, we should respect the right of every person to share their gift. And the great Sonny Rollins, who is not Jewish, whom I knew since 1955 when I played with Charles Mingus, said, you know, man, he said, we're so worried about the COVID and the current administration, we forget the golden rule. He said, the golden rule is in not just in Leviticus, but in every major religion in the world. And he said, that's all I think about. I'm 90 years old. He's 2 months older than me. He said, that's all I think about. The golden rule. I'm trying to practice that every day. And I've never been happier, even though I'm infirmed. I can't play the saxophone, but it gives me time 24 hours a day to think about that. And then he said, we have to remember the body turns to dust, but the spirit lives forever. And I said, wow, that's what all of us are brought up to believe in. And if you can somehow keep that belief going, human rights is just a part of that freedom that everyone should be entitled to be themselves and to be able to care for others and have other people respect you as much as you respect them. Rabbi Akiva said, that's all you need to know is that wonderful prayer. He said, Rabbi Akiva said a long time ago, he said, all the rest in the Talmud is translated as conjecture or discussion. It's much more than that, of course, and I think the reason why we see so many old people, and my grandfather, who was brought up, my father was Orthodox, said the really old scholars could put the pin through the Talmud and they would know exactly where that pin was on each page and have that memorized. That's why you always saw the old people studying and reading and studying. So they're kind of our gyroscope. And I am humbled by the fact that I'm even a tiny fraction of that tradition.
That's great.
Seeing a question in the chat here from Nils Falk. Apart from the tear in the voice, what do you think are the musical characteristics of Jewish musical heritage? Which I always think is an interesting thing to talk about.
I think it all comes from the Middle East somehow. And when the Yemenites took what they called the magic carpet, they'd never been out of that part of the Middle East for over 1,000 years, and they'd never been in an airplane. They called it the magic carpet when the people in the Sephardic community there were allowed to come to Israel. They brought that with them. And when we see pictures on Ellis Island and you see the people showing up off of the boat with nothing but what they could carry on their back, they always had a Bible, almost always of some kind, and an instrument of some kind, and the song and the history in their heart, and a way of cooking food, and a language and a way of speaking, and a familial human sense. And somehow that has magically survived right here, where we have everything anyone could dream of except that. And those are the most important things in life. And if you lose those fundamental values, as to misquote Porgy and Bess, you ain't got nothing. I hope that answers your question.
Mute myself. Hi, David. Fascinating as ever. I just love you. The words of wisdom come out. It's so great. What I want to know, try to understand, I believe personally there's no such thing as modern Jewish music, because what we get from the heart and the soul of our people is from our past, which determines the present and the future. So would you agree to the fact that there isn't such a thing as modern Jewish music, or am I completely wrong?
I think you're completely right, because essentially music has nothing to do with being modern or old-fashioned. If it's beautiful, it stays beautiful. Bach is very, very hip, very relevant, doesn't need window dressing or plastic surgery or being reinvented in order to be relevant. I enjoy all those people. When I was in Paris, they had the people who sang Bach. They were wonderful. And when Switched on Bach came, I said, boy, isn't that nice? And when Glenn Gould played the Goldberg variations on the piano and somehow made you able to hear all those voices at the same time, it still is a miracle. But Bach's music, which he wrote a long time ago, still sounds as fresh and beautiful as ever. When you hear Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, it's unbelievably moving and modern sounding. Something Keats, the great poet, said in his Ode to the Grecian Urn, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. And I would say that's truthful in our music. So if we think about the past, of course, that's the beautiful thing of heritage. And it's no crime to celebrate the past. And I think the most modern thing you can do is to deal with the past with reverence and bring that up to the now and add a tiny bit of what you feel to what's already been there before you. So I don't think that they have to change the Bible or the Torah or any other books, Buddhism or the, the all the major religions in the world, and those that we don't know about. In the United States, the Native American people somehow have kept some of their songs and traditions and even language. And I just spoke to Joanne Shenandoah, great Oneida spokesperson as well as a great singer. She said, "Man, we're still here." And I think the same can be said of Jewish people. We're still here. And that in itself is
So
modern
why is
enough.
it that we are told that the new generation, the children today, don't want the old, but want to reinvent the wheel, which sounds a bit ridiculous.
Well, I think it's because a lot of us who taught those younger people were brainwashed with the same misinformation. And we were told, don't have anything in your presence that reminds you of chicken soup that your grandmother cooked. And being a fourth generation Jewish person, my family came here just before the woe between the states. I say woe rather than war because they landed in the port of Savannah. My great grandfather was conscripted into the, I beg your pardon, my great grandfather was conscripted into the Confederate Army, which was scarcely what he came over here to do. But I was told, well, you've been here a long time, so you must be a white bread Jew. And I said, well, perhaps you could refer to me that way, but I have a lot of pumpernickel in my DNA. And that's a beautiful thing. And you can appreciate what some of the Native American people told me for identity, how the Indians could survive the worst depression constantly. They said you have to have your feet in both canoes so we can be a modern person and still maintain the gift of our heritage. And I think we can't blame anything on the new generation. Whatever is wrong is our fault. We set the plate for them to come to dinner. They weren't cooking the dinner or inviting us. So therefore, it's our job, those of us that feel that they deserve better, to try to put out a little something while we're here and encourage the people we know who might have been brought up to think that they were too ethnic and somehow find a way to maintain that, just as the Moranos did when they were told, unlike my relatives who were thrown out of Portugal and Spain and stayed there, they kept their Jewish religion, but they just kind of kept it undercover. But they didn't lose it. And now, centuries later, bam, they suddenly came out and said, man, we've been Jewish all along. So if that was possible, it's certainly easy for us in a more or less free society, so to speak, to do the same thing. And I think that that's happening, not just in the Jewish traditions, but all people are beginning to see that we're all a part of Joseph's coat of many colors, and each color and each part of that coat is beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. I have just an observation to kind of piggyback on Alex was saying there, which is that you were talking about, growing up 50s and 60s being told to tone down your ethnicity. I think very much now composers are expected to tone it up, which is to say, if you are a Jewish composer, why wouldn't you want to express that? Or I wonder if have you noticed any kind of change like that over the course of your career? Not only that it is okay to sort of express that heritage and identity, but almost expected, maybe to the point that even if you're not doing it, people are looking for those kind of clues somewhere in there in your music.
And conversely, you shouldn't be told that if you're Jewish, you can't do anything else, or if you're not Jewish, you can't understand anything about Judaism. When I wrote my cantata, Let Us Remember, based on the Yiskar, the great Langston Hughes, African-American poet, was invited to take the old prayers and translate them into English, as well as using Hebrew, and try to make it in relationship to our times of oppression to others here in this country. And the rabbi in charge of the whole event started a great pontifical lecture about, well, Mr. Hughes, you have to understand, we have a special feeling that's almost genetic. He went on and on and on. Langston sat there very quietly. Finally, when the rabbi took a breath, he said, Rabbi, I understand what you're speaking about because my grandfather was Jewish. And that ended the conversation. But Yo-Yo Ma is not from the Bach family, but when he plays Bach, he's the voice of Bach because he submitted himself to a higher power that he loved. And Leonard Bernstein, who went to Israel and spoke in Hebrew while people were still trying to learn Ivrit, he gave lectures in Hebrew in Israel many years ago, right after Israel was founded, as a conductor, and reminded all the people in the audience of our heritage. But Leonard Bernstein was able to do all kinds of music beautifully, including Jewish music. So I don't think we should be excluded from anything, nor should we feel that we have to be excluded from everything. Just our heritage is something precious, so is everyone else's. And if you understand your own, then you can appreciate and be welcome into other people's lives because they don't feel this person is coming because they don't like themselves or confused and they want to swipe what we have and try to be us, and then they can be somebody. We have to start out with ourselves, with our families, and then from there, life is an open book and an open road towards trying to get a little more knowledge while we're here.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for David? I think we're probably getting close to wrapping up here.
I would be very happy to say how much I've enjoyed this and how much everybody else has enjoyed it. Really loving both you and your music. And I think that I share your view. When I started dealing in Jewish music, which was 30-something years ago, as a concert promoter rather than a musician, I felt that I was touching a red hot cable that was running from the Bible to infinity, and that people wanted to be warmed by its glow. And that's why I've spent the rest of my time since then trying to make Jewish music available to as many people as possible in as many different ways as possible. And you've been a wonderful way to be part of that. So thank you so much.
Oh, I thank you. That's the most beautiful thing I could hear. I hope I have been a part of it that's been helpful, not just to what I'm trying to do, but what we're trying to do and what all of those who came before us are trying to do. and what the younger generation will do and teach their children that they can do. That's the hope that we all have. I think it's harder when you're younger to think about that because you're just thinking, I hope I can pay the rent and then maybe find something else to do that's interesting. And then when you get a family and they have to be supported, then you could forget about everything. And then if you're in the arts where everybody is trying to be number one top dog competitive super monster of the century until they're overthrown by someone else, you could forget about what we're supposed to be doing in the first place, not to mention why we're here and who we are. That's the great thing about getting older, because you can realize what Robert Frost said. He said, a great American poet, he said, I'm an old man and I finally figured out what life is about. And it's only 3 words: it goes on. And Robert Burns, the great Scottish jazz poet of the 18th century, said, the best laid plans of mice and men oft go awry. And how true that is. So all we can do is hope each day that we can do better, try and do our best. And if we mess up, realize that we're just human, but that shouldn't mean we're derailed permanently. We just got to do better and hopefully know how to say please and toda rabah, thank you, to someone to bail us out so we can try. And then after you've made the same mistake about 500 times, then you could have the Solomon-esque wisdom of old age, because you can tell your kids and grandkids, I'm not sure how to do it, but I can tell you how not to do it.
What's really interesting about this particular forum that we're in is that we are sharing so much between different kinds of people. We have here composers, we have scholars, we have cantors, we have singers, we have people who are arrangers, and somehow we have people who are interested in cantorial music or in klezmer music, and somehow, or classical music. They're all sharing and taking something from each other, which this amazing technology has given us the opportunity to do. So it's thanks to everybody who's here, but thanks to you for giving your wisdom and your experience to everybody who's listening and who will listen, because this will be streamed on our YouTube channel. So forever we'll be able to listen to your wisdom and to your music.
Well, I thank you. And I would say, I'm not sure if it's wisdom, but it's just experience and being around those who definitely had some wisdom, which they shared with me. With, I guess, with the tacit understanding, I would try to pass some of that on. And I'm not saying that to be modest or humble. That's just the truth. And my hope is anybody listening, if you're a cantor or a singer or a folk musician or an arranger or a symphony composer, or you just like music, that the important thing is to be you, not to copy me, not to copy anyone, but to be you and find a way to tell and share your story with others.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us this morning for those of us on the West Coast, this afternoon for you, and getting very late into the evening, I think, for some of our friends who are overseas. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I learn something new every time I speak to you, and I'm for that I am grateful. Thank you to Geraldine for inviting me to be a part of COZ. I've attended many sessions. This is the first one I've hosted, and I look forward to hosting more in the future. Thanks to Mark and Lori over at UCLA as well.
And can I wish everyone Hag Sameach, a happy Hanukkah, and all the other beautiful holidays which we can all rejoice in celebrating with those who hopefully will appreciate our wonderful Festival of the Lights as part of the whole panoply of spirituality which everyone has in their own way to realize that there's a higher force than us, and that we have to think about that in the ways that we are most comfortable and in the ways that we were brought up, if we are comfortable and embrace that heritage. And I hope all of you do. And I'm just flattered and honored to be part of this, and wish everybody a beautiful holiday and great luck, good mazel, and be good to your kids because they need us.
Thank you. And Jeff, we must thank you also for being really a rock and a star in running this session. And we hope that you'll do many more. If I can just tell you what's coming next, we have 2 more sessions this side of the new year. And that is Agnes Corey will be talking about Hungarian Jewish musicians who were affected by the Holocaust and how to reinstate and reestablish their music. And she'll be talking with David Fligg. And that's next week. And the week after that, your friend Michael Shapiro will be talking with Elliot Forrest about his music, also in the series called Composer in Focus. But we have a fantastic, suddenly we've got another 6 months of COZ nearly all filled up for the coming year. And we've got such exciting things that's going to, the session will be opened by Eliyahu Schleifer with Naomi Konzentner again. And they'll be talking about Hanukkah, about candle lighting and about songs for Hanukkah. Pity it's not before Hanukkah, but it'll still have Hanukkah fresh in our minds. Then we have another session on Nusach, this time with Cantor Yalda Rebling and the first ordained cantor in Britain, Cantor Jacqueline Chernett, who will be talking about Nusach with Kavanah. Then we've got Baruch Cohen, who's talking with Jonathan Morgan. And if you don't know his name, he's the great grandson of A.Z. Idelson. And he's going to talk about a book that Jonathan has just written about his great-great-grandfather. Then we have Isabel Gans is talking with Susanna Weich-Schachat, and they're talking about field recordings and modern recordings of Sephardi songs. We have Professor Hirschberg with Irit Youngerman from Israel talking about the beginnings of musical life in Palestine. Then we've got a pre-cantorial, pre-Pesach cantorial event where we'll have a panel of cantors talking about the problems and the joys of Pesach with or without Zoom. And with or without a pandemic or a pandemonium, I was going to say. Josh Horowitz and friends is going to talk about Cosmic Diaspora's new CD, Purple Tentacles of Thought and Desire. So how that is connected to Jewish music will be a wonder for us all to witness. We're hoping that Phil Alexander, who's just written a book about klezmer, will be talking to Ilana Webster-Kogan, who's the Jolos Lecturer in Jewish Music at SOAS, the University of London. Boaz is going to have 2 sessions back-to-back, Boaz Tarsi. We don't know the exact details yet, but we wait with bated breath. So it goes on. That's already up to April, and there's more coming after that. So stay tuned and enjoy this wonderful cross-fertilization of Jewish musical genres, voices, and ideas. So thanks to everybody again.